is Fedva. Today's podcast is going to be on brainwashing. And the reason I wanted to do this podcast was earlier on in engagements and conversations with others on faith. There was accusations of brainwashing, and I have done several blogs to show about what blind faith is and what faith in God, genuine true faith in God is. But there has been accusations hurled at Prophet Abraham, as well as the relationship he had with his spouses. Those accusations were accusations of brainwashing. And I wanted to touch on that because my next chapter in my book, I have been discussing some of the chapters in my book, and I stopped at Noah. I still have some more videos regarding Prophet Noah, upon him peace. Is right after that is Lessons on Truth from Prophet Abraham, upon him peace. And I touched on surrender and submission because the time of that conversation, many try to promote submission or present submission and surrender to God as a form of brainwashing. And they use the concept, for example, of conversion therapy, even though, like the faith says, there's no compulsion in religion. There were many attacks and many accusations hurled and many obfuscations. So this has been read many, many years ago. It wasn't just now. And I spent a considerable amount of time thinking about it, but I found a nice, concise, easy to read article. So you don't need to go read all of those other works, but you could just read this very simple article, which I will link to the podcast, about brainwashing. And after reflecting on brainwashing and how it works, as I said, we start with the definition and then the actions. Then I will have a video up shortly after that on surrender and submission, lessons from Prophet Abraham, on my YouTube channel. So to begin, one of the ways that people identified stages of brainwashing is by studying, for example, many psychologists have studied, and there was one in this particular article that's mentioned. So the Korean War, the Chinese war camps, and others, where they identified stages of brainwashing. One is assault on the identity, guilt, and you'll see me, I've written quite a few blogs on guilt and remorse and the difference between both. And the reason I tend to be raising the fire alarms on guilt is because it has been used as a form of psychological abuse against targets or scapegoats, as a way to mentally and emotionally abuse them and brainwash them. There's self-betrayal, another stage, breaking point, leniency, compulsion to confess. And this is again where I talked about quite a few blogs, and you probably have been monitoring me saying confession versus repentance. Channeling of guilt is another stage, releasing of guilt, progress and harmony, final confession and rebirth. So this is a form of, again, how you brainwash someone into what you want them to be. Now, in this article, again, it says that you have to keep using these techniques to keep the brainwashed person brainwashed, because they generally lose connection to their selves. And so they become under the brainwashers, you will, they'll become under the brainwashers' power. And we saw that, for example, in the magicians with Prophet Moses' story and the Pharaoh. Also, they acknowledged that they were brainwashed. He said, we were this out of compulsion, but only God knows who's brainwashed or not. But when psychologists might be able to identify, but when God sent Moses there, he was able to break that brainwashing hold between the Pharaoh and the magicians. They were able to break free. Sometimes also God knows some of the accusations, the false accusations that we are going to hurl against others. And he leaves out certain clues, if you will, and hints that point out to the falseness, the deceitfulness of these accusations, and some of that being Hajar. And I mentioned that in one of the videos, I believe, on Prophet Abraham. There were accusations again that she was brainwashed. And one of the things you learn about brainwashing is if you create a separation between the brainwasher and the person or the target who's being brainwashed, is the impact and the effects of brainwashing is gone. So you can no longer, for example, the person who's brainwashed is no longer brainwashed. So if you ever are in a cult, if you will, I apologize, I keep having something stuck in my throat. If you're ever in a cult and you're brainwashed and then you're separated, over time it takes like years, but then the brainwashing effect goes away. If you study domestic violence situations where brainwashing is used, it takes years for the impact of brainwashing to go away. It takes years, and then after the target realizes that they were brainwashed, they regain in their original self. So what happens when you move the brainwasher from the brainwashed? The brainwashed person just goes back to being who they were before the brainwashing. The real self, the real personality just comes back. So there's never really like, I keep talking about repentance and remorse. There's never really like a growth. There's never like, it's different like than like you change conscientiously with your own consent and your own permission. And that's just the person you choose to be at that point in time. And then the next 10 years, you may learn more, grow more, and now that's that person you are. It's once the brainwashing is removed, you go back to being the person that you were before you were brainwashed, that you had given consent to be. So just briefly to talk about brainwashing, there's breaking down the self. This is an assault on identity. And you see me touched on that in Prophet Moses, where I say one of the things that they do is they make you hate yourself in your own eyes. It's a systematic attack on a target's sense of self. Guilt, you are bad. That's another stage. And this is where everything you do, everything you say, you're guilty. So the identity crisis is setting in. The agent is then simultaneously creating an overwhelming sense of guilt in the target agent, being the brainwasher. So that person then continually criticizes a target for everything from the evilness of his belief to the way he eats too slowly. So it just nonstop. The idea is to make the person feel bad. And that's why when you're criticizing faith, and I wrote a blog about guilt, remorse, the self-help placebo. What happens is if you're constantly guilt, that becomes like you start to attack the person's identity, the person's self. And what you try to then do is nurture the next stage, which is self-betrayal. And this is where we have, for example, even Muslim youth, they start to have a false sense, for example, of who they are. Are they Muslim? Are they not Muslim? What is Islam? So it creates disorientation. Excuse me, let me just drink a bit. Drowning in guilt. So the brainwasher forces the target, with the person who's being brainwashed, to this continuous of mental attack, to denounce whatever it is they want them to denounce. It could be family, it could be friends, it could be the wrong belief system, but they have to denounce. But it constantly is about feeling bad, the betrayal of their own beliefs and of people. He feels a sense of loyalty increases. And then again, the use of shame. Shame, not remorse. And I talked about, again, difference between shame and remorse. And I think some people are still not getting it, but hopefully over time, it will be understood. What you come to is a loss of identity, and the target starts to experience like that they don't know who they are. So now you have disorientation. You go from, the self-betrayal, which is known by disorientation. That's why when you look for domestic violence victims, the number one things you want to look for is not how well they can tell you somebody smacked them, but you look for signs of disorientation, where like the sense of self is just not there. Like the person just has no sense of self. Either they're recovering, they're separated from the brainwasher, they're still brainwashed in the brainwashed state, but you look for signs of disorientation. Reaches then to the breaking point. And this is where the person really loses their identity. So it becomes an identity crisis. And I mentioned earlier on, I remember with Hawarfan, she called it soul loss, where there's a complete disconnection between like the soul and the identity and the self, just a complete total disconnection. It's almost, and I mentioned that like in the horse and the rider, but the horse, where the soul representing the rider is like completely thrown off the horse. So now the brainwasher controls, if you will, that person's identity. And so there's that soul loss where you're just totally don't know who you really are, where you are, what you're supposed to do. And it's beautiful that the Qur'an asks such a phenomenal question that really hints and points at this state. And it says, then where are you going? So that very beautiful question. It's in the Quran. Then where are you going? And that's really where it points to the state of individuals who have reached that point where they're so brainwashed. They don't know who they are, where they are, and even where they're going. What are they supposed to do? So this is something else to also note. And when you're breaking down the self, others in psychology refer to it as nervous breakdown. Now, you may not see it externally as a nervous breakdown because the person may look happy and all great and wonderful. But there's a soul loss. And there is a nervous breakdown, though, outside the person, and I don't want to mention the name, somebody who was a high achiever, doing wonderful things, involved with a lot of social justice activities, very good looking, very smart, very bright future ahead of her. Recently just, for example, they say committed suicide. On the outside, it looked like, a very high achieving, very successful. So what's going on? And that's, again, where I talk about egoism versus conformity. You can have brainwashing from an individual where they're trying to come between you and your soul, or you could also have it from conformity, like the crowd. And not to, again, mention anything like particular, but how it's being done and how conversations sometimes are taking place. They nurture not a healthy advancement or a healthy enrichment and growth, but brainwashing. So instead of people coming to understand something and coming to be convinced of something, they're really brainwashed into a lifestyle. And the indicators for that is that if you leave them alone, they don't know who they are. They don't know where they're going, and they don't know what they're really supposed to do. Even though on the outside they're high achievers and they're successful and they're doing everything great, but there's a soul loss, and that soul loss points to an impact due to brainwashing that is taking place. Something, again, to reflect on and consider. I don't want to go too much into brainwashing, but I want to point out two more other things for you to reflect on. Sometimes a brainwasher will show leniency, and it's an attempt to show kindness as a way to offer the person to confess, to relieve the guilt and the pain. Guilt is the real reason many subjects are in pain. 2 weeks or months of assault, confusion, breakdown, the target's guilt has lost all meaning. He's not sure what he has done wrong. He just knows he's wrong. And that's the point of where I get at guilt. As you keep telling someone you feel guilty, 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 confess. This is really a process of brainwashing. The person will eventually, depending on, again, their character, will confess to guilt. And we see that, for example, in torture. In Israeli, for example, torture, or even under the CIA, where psychologists use that to get confessions. Eventually, the person breaks down and they start to confess to whatever it is they need to confess, just to relieve the pain and the guilt. So this creates a blank state that lets the agent or the brainwasher fill in the blanks. Feel guilty for 1, 2, 3. This is your sense of wrongness, whatever you want. And the agent attaches the target's guilt to whatever they want it to be replaced with. The contracts between the old and new has been established. Now, the psychological agony, you might say, stopped. And now they will try to, the brainwasher will try to, if you will, like replace the former identity with a new identity. So this person will now become, after releasing himself, confessing from the wrongness, and now this person will have a whole new identity. And now that new identity will be rebuilt, and the brainwashing is complete. The subject is then presented with a path to alleged progress and harm. In other words, if you want, you can choose good. At this stage, the agent stops the abuse, offering the target physical comfort and mental calm in conjunction with the new belief system. And the target is made to feel that they may choose, that is, he who must choose between the old and new, giving the target the sense that his fate is in own hand, which is not true, because if they choose the wrong choice, they will continue with the attacks, psychological attacks, until the new identity is chosen. Next comes the final confession and rebirth. And this is how then the brainwashing process comes in. And they talked about how this has been used through the Korean War, the Chinese camps, and we see it now happening in China with the Muslims in the camps where they're using brainwashing. And of course, they're referring to it as re-education camps. Certain personality traits of the brainwashing targets can determine the effectiveness of the process. And people who commonly experience, like, they have a weak sense of identity, they show a tendency toward guilt and absolutism, like black and white thinking, are more likely to be successfully brainwashed. While a strong sense of identity and self-confidence can make a target more resistant to brainwashing. Some accounts show that faith in a higher power, and here's the point that I'm trying to get at with this article, a faith in a higher power can assist a target in mentally detaching from the process. Let me repeat that again. Some accounts show that faith in a higher power can assist a target in mentally detaching from the process. So physically, you cannot remove yourself from the brainwasher, mentally, or spiritually, emotionally, like by connecting, if you will, to God, you can detach from the process. People who've suffered also abuse in childhood, have been exposed to eccentric family patterns, and who have substance abuse issues are also more likely to be influenced. And again, probably hints at why some, like alcohol, is forbidden in Islam. Again, if Islam wanted people to be brainwashed, it would allow alcohol. But Islam is very much against the idea of your being in a state where you're more likely to be at risk of brainwashing. Mental detachment is one of the prisoners of war survival techniques, and it was taught to soldiers as part of their training. It's now taught to soldiers, as part of their training, because they learned that the repetition of a mantra and various other meditative techniques can actually break the cycle of brainwashing. And you've seen me mention dhikr, like when someone is using these type of psychological techniques, and in fact, the Qur'an itself points to dhikr. So certain repetition, constant repetition of a mantra and various other meditative techniques can help, like they can psychologically remove the person through visualization, and it helps them to break the cycle or short circuit the cycle of brainwashing. And in the Quran, you see that. And I mentioned where the Quran talks about where people are being hints at that there's humiliation being used. But when you connect to the one who needs no protection from humiliation, and you just keep magnifying him, and then you're visually trying to imagine something else, you can break that cycle of people trying to brainwash you. And that has the military also teaches soldiers about the methods used in brainwashing, because the knowledge of how brainwashing is done can help the person prepare of how to protect themselves mentally, emotionally, again, socially, from brainwashing. So we see, again, like I said, brainwashing didn't just exist during that Korean, like the article mentions, the Korean War, the Chinese camps. Again, they refer to it as re-education. But in other, times, like during the Russia, they said the communist Russia in the early 1900s, it was used. There are also groups that have used brainwashing in their cults. In 1953, the CIA began a program, I think MKULTRA, MKULTRA, and they gave subject LSD in order to study the effect of mind-altering drugs and gauge the effectiveness of brainwashing-friendly state of mind. Again, why Islam strongly prohibits anything that plays with your state of mind to protect you from brainwashing. It's not just the physical, but also the mental, the emotional protection that it helps their subjects. The results were not that encouraging, and the subjects were supposedly harmed by the experiments. So it was canceled. Those experiments were canceled. Public interest in brainwashing briefly subsided after the Cold War, but resurfaced in the 1960s. You've seen possibly, like I said, like the cults, some like the mass suicides, the killing sprees committed by a small percentage of those cults seem to validate, again, the brainwashing fears. One supposed victim of brainwashing at the time of Patty Hearst, heirs to the Hearst publishing fortune, would later use a brainwashing defense when she was on trial for a bank robbery. So, there's also that it's being used in cults. So see it used in various parts of society. Now, again, it mentions that when you remove and you separate the brainwasher from the brainwashed, then the person goes back to their true original self. And it's important to reflect on that as well. This is also different than being conditioned. Like if a person is repeatedly praised for certain behaviors and penalized for others, he or she naturally gravitates toward the desired behavior. This is used all the time with training children or dogs to behave, but it's definitely not considered brainwashing under those circumstances. There isn't like a breaking down of the self. You're just using social pressure or rewarding or pleasure as a way to promote certain behaviors for a certain social norm. So that's not considered brainwashing. Again, brainwashing is about this breaking down the self. It's constant, systematic attacks, letting the person in their own eyes believe they're bad, unless they become submissive to you. So some individuals who have been, if you will, brainwashed, they're usually like inspired by a life-changing event, like such a near-miss accident, a loss of a loved one, or other major experience. So no one is really forcibly telling the person what to do or how to behave, but they seek out other people with similar views to feel validated. It's not just that easy to change a person's core personality or belief system. And the correct use of brainwashing can do quite this service. So it's important to know what brainwashing is and what brainwashing is not. Like, so if, for example, you lost a loved one and you, out of your own consent and your own permission, or you nearly got into a near death in life experience, like you nearly like died, or like some major event that really shook you and impacted your core. But this was not someone constantly impacting, attacking you, but you on your own, it shook you to the point that you started to discover who you are, what you want, where you want to go. And you still had power over your choice to make. And you started to research and you changed, like these life-changing experiences. That's not considered brainwashing, because that's you having power and, again, growing due to life experiences. And I talked about that earlier in the podcast about growth, where the person that you were before is no longer the person that you are now, because you just, you learned more about things, life experiences challenged you, and you understood things more, and so you grew. So that's not considered brainwashing. And if you went and separated, you're still stuck to that new understanding and new growth. You're not like this kind of disoriented person where you don't know where you are, where you're going, and you just go back to wherever it is that you used to believe in. So it's something to reflect on. I don't want to read the whole article for you, but just pointing out certain things that I'd like you to focus on and to reflect on as I'm preparing for my video on chapter 7. And this is lessons on surrender and submission, or truth to God, from God, truth from God, or surrender to God, from the story and the life experiences of Prophet Abraham, upon him peace. So thank you very much for listening. I appreciate any feedback that you can give. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.